The Fair Deal panel report is out. It says Albertans want a new deal with Ottawa. They want to replace the RCMP with a Provincial Police Department. They want a referendum on equalization payments. They want to take control of their pension plan. They want to wrestle it out of the hands of Ottawa. And they're demanding more representation in the House of Commons. Those are just some of the 25 recommendations in the report that came from thousands of Albertans who attended Fair Deal panel hearings. Number one at the top of the list, renegotiate the equalization deal. Albertans point to the fact the province sent $23 billion a year to Ottawa each and every year for the past 5 years. Last year, Quebec received $13 billion of that money, and in doing so, balanced its budget, but at the same time said, we don't want your dirty oil, just your money. Comments like that, and those from outgoing Green Party leader Elizabeth May and the leader of the Bloc Québécois, both attempting to block COVID-19 relief payments to Alberta because they said oil is dead. And you can see why, when you add in comments like that, why Albertans are unhappy. We invited Josh Andrus of Project Confederation and a contributor to the Western Standard to join us for this episode of Western Alienation. Josh, thanks for joining me. That's a nice backdrop behind you. You know, it's an iconic one in the landscape of Canadian cities, yet it's suffering.
Very much so. Unemployment rate in Alberta has obviously gone up due to COVID, but it's been a common theme over the last 5 years that the energy sector, which has been a driving force of Alberta's and Canada's economy over the last 50 plus years, has been under immense pressure, not just in terms of global economic conditions, but federal government policies such as Bill C-69 and C-48. And it's one of those things that it's really stressful to see, but at the same time it makes you want to commit more to fighting for it.
And fighting for it you are. Josh, you're a columnist with the Western Standard. What is that publication and what is its editorial point of view?
At the end of the day, the Western Standard is the voice of, it's a needed voice of essentially conservative conservative free market values. And as a columnist, my focus is definitely on what I do. I am the executive director of Project Confederation, so all of my columns are geared towards Western alienation and topics like that. Lately, the conversation has become almost a federalist versus independence nature. Project Confederation has taken a middle ground in that approach. We haven't taken a position on separation, but it's definitely something that there has been a debate on both sides of the aisle regarding that topic.
What exactly is Project Confederation?
Project Confederation is an independent third-party organization that was founded about a year ago. Our sole objective is to get a better deal for Alberta within the Confederation of Canada. We issued an open letter to Premier Kenney entitled A New Alberta Agenda the day after the federal election, in which we pushed for 9 different policy points. The first 3 policy points on the agenda were constitutional in nature. We at Project Confederation believe that the only way we can get a fair deal for Alberta is with constitutional reform in 3 main areas. The first and probably most pressing is to abolish Canada's Equalization program. We view it as a program that has taken advantage of Alberta's wealth and has essentially, especially in times like this, has really left us at a disadvantage. Jason Kenney has, during the election campaign, promised that in the event that Trans Mountain is not constructed, that he will hold a referendum to abolish Section 36, which is Section 36 subsection 2, which is referendum on equalization, to abolish it from the Constitution. The 2 other constitutional points are Senate reform. 199 out of the 338 seats in the House of Commons are based in Ontario and Quebec. That creates an environment in which 2 provinces dictate to the rest of the country how to operate. Now, I don't necessarily think that their intention is malicious, but when you have a system that is geared to promote the interests of 2 provinces above and beyond that of anything else, you get natural problems. So by pushing for a Triple E Senate, one that is elected, so it has legitimacy It is equal, so an equal number of senators per province, and it has effective powers over the House of Commons, so it can act as a check. The third policy point on Constitution is free trade across Canada, unrestricted free trade across Canada. We have a current environment in which provinces are able to block trade of goods, services, and infrastructure such as railways and pipelines to serve their purposes. It's created an environment where people are frustrated, and if you can't trade within your country, what's the point of staying in it?
Well, that's a good point. You talk about the fact that you don't think that it was malicious on behalf of the power base that resides in the two main eastern provinces, Quebec and Ontario. However, I beg to differ, because if you go back to 1905, when Alberta and Saskatchewan were created, they were carved out of what was the Northwest Territories at the time. Then Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier, and he's on record as saying this, he says he worried that Alberta or the Northwest Territories or the whole region would be too powerful of a political bloc, and he didn't want that to happen. And so there was intent, and it was created to be carried out the way that it has ever since. And so I think you're right to say there needs to be a better deal for Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the Northwest Territories to have appropriate representation.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's probably the most, I'd say that the Senate reform is probably the most important aspect of what we're trying to accomplish here. At the end of the day, you may be able to elect a government that is not directly impacting Alberta's ability to operate. But in the event that you do get a government that is geared towards Eastern interests, you're just naturally going to have policies that negatively impact Alberta's ability to navigate increasingly choppy macroeconomic waters. And that's why you need to see those changes. There needs to be representation by region, at least on equal footing with representation by population as we have right now. The House of Commons essentially is a tyranny of the majority, where 2/3 of the seats are in two provinces, and therefore the policies come out of there are going to be geared to help those people more so than they are out west.
In doing my research, I was trying to find out what the differences are in the deal that Alberta has with Confederation from those that Ontario and Quebec have.
I think the big difference is the just lack of representation. We have an environment, and I don't want to say taxation without representation, but I'm going to say taxation without representation. We're shipping over $20 billion a year to the rest of the country, over $611 billion since the Equalization program was implemented in the late 1950s. And that's, in essence, the underlying cause of the frustration. Is there is a lack of awareness in the East of especially when we are experiencing struggles the way we are. And I think that's led to a difference in opinion of federal government policies from the West and the East. And yeah.
Former Premier Peter Lougheed was able to wrestle control of the energy sector from the feds. And while he was able to do that, he wasn't able to get control of the environment. And now we're seeing it's that environment legislation that is working against Alberta's ability to determine its own outcome. Is it important that Alberta gain control over the environment as well as the energy sector?
I think you can make that argument for sure, but at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to achieve that unless you do have constitutional reform. The environment is constitutionally enshrined as federal jurisdiction, but at the end of the day, in order for Alberta, like I've said before, to get a fair deal is to open up the Constitution and have a real discussion. We need absolutely every policy position on the table. We need to go in there with a strong negotiating position and make our case, because at the end of the day, I don't know how much longer this province can take this. I mean, COVID-19 just has escalated an economic condition that you can basically say we went from a recession to a calamity. Oil prices combined with just overall unemployment across the board, retail bankruptcies, and look behind me, right? I mean, a lot of those offices are empty, and that's something where we have to address that. And the only way we can get a fair deal, like I said, is to open up the Constitution and address those issues.
So after the last federal election, of course, Premier Kenney, sensing that there was a tremendous amount of frustration amongst voters here in the West in general and in Alberta in particular, struck the Fair Deal panel. Was that an attempt to placate an angry voter base, or was it actually to find ways to renegotiate or open up discussions with the federal government?
You could make the case that he did it to placate it, but at the end of the day, there's going to be I think there's going to be a lot of great ideas in the Fair Deal panel report. It's up to the Premier to decide whether or not he wants to implement those ideas. We at Project Confederation organized speakers, we issued statements, and we did our best to get our policy positions into the panel report through whatever means necessary. But at the end of the day, it's up to the Premier's office to actually take action.
When you talk about opening up the Constitution and really re-examining the relationship between Edmonton and Ottawa, those are elements that can make a real difference. When you first saw the direction that the Fair Deal panel was taking, which looked like it was a carbon copy of the Firewall letter that was written by former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, Preston Manning, and Tom Flanagan and others, were you a little bit disappointed that it wasn't going far enough?
The mandate letter that Kenney wrote to the Fair Deal panel did include one clause that was constitutional, and it was based on his initial election promise that the government of Alberta, without significant progress on the Trans Mountain Pipeline, would hold a referendum to abolish Section 32, subsection 2 from the Canadian Constitution. Now, if Kenney follows through on that, Rainer Knopp, one of the authors of the Firewall letter, has actually written a very good policy piece on constitutional reform, and his point essentially is that if Alberta were to hold and pass a referendum on a constitutional item such as Section 36, subsection 2, that it forces Ottawa to come to the bargaining table via the Supreme Court reference of the Quebec secession reference of 1988, I think it was.
The report was just released. Do you believe that the responses to the panel from a wide variety of submissions maybe went further than the Premier was expecting?
You know what? As somebody who has been in politics for a few years, I usually try and go into things with an open mind. So if I'm sitting in the Premier's chair, I'm thinking that, hey, I don't know what to expect. Based on my feedback, I saw more people that were defending different policy positions that were in the mandate letter than going outside of that. Obviously, you did have maybe 20 to 30, maybe 40% of speakers, it varied by place to place, that would actually speak that separation is the answer. But most people that spoke that were in favor of the Fair Deal panel's mandate letter were saying, do this, and if this doesn't work, then we'll separate. So I would assume that the Premier was expecting that. I can't speak for him. I'm not working in the office. But to me, the reaction that people had wasn't out of my expectations, so why would it be out of his?
You talked about the sense of alienation growing, and that if you don't see progress there, then maybe separation becomes the next step. And from what I can see, that is a growing opinion. There appears to be this growing chorus of voices that are saying, forget alienation, let's just go for a referendum on separation, because that at least will force Ottawa's hand. You're reading the mood of the province. Do you think that there is enough support for that?
The way that, based on information I have, and obviously I don't have anything updated since the outbreak of COVID, but the information I had was about 75% of people are unhappy with the status quo. Now you can divide that, I think based on the information that I was presented, about 33% of Albertans are prepared to separate today. Now that is definitely going to be skewed more to rural Alberta. Those people, they've been hit probably worse than anybody else. And But then you have about 40% that are just frustrated with status quo but aren't quite ready to go there. And those are the people that kind of fit in the Fair Deal Panel's mandate, where they want to see concrete steps to increase Alberta's autonomy within Federation. And if those steps fail to alleviate the pressure that Ottawa is putting on Albertans, then they are willing to take the extra step. But at the moment, I'd say that's the breakdown.
You talk about rural Alberta because to a large extent the agricultural sector now seems to be becoming the focus of attention from people who are pointing the finger at Alberta saying you're the problem when it comes to the environment. Is that fair? And is it a piling on of voices? Is that in turn riling the rancor of the average Albertan?
In terms of environmentalists and rural Alberta, those people make their living off of the land, and therefore they should care more about the environment than anybody else. They do their research. They have to study soil erosion. They have to study weather patterns. Like, this is what they do. Those people are actually coming under attack by environmentalists that live in concrete office towers in big cities and are effectively decided that not just the energy sector is to blame, it's the farmers. And it's the way that they operate. And to me, that's just completely unacceptable. At the end of the day, we have to be able to come up with a solution that actually takes into account everybody's view. And the agricultural industry in Alberta is, I think it's the second biggest. I could be wrong. I mean, don't quote me on that. But it's an economic driver, and it's one of those things where if our agriculture sector is going, a large part of the province is actually firing on all cylinders. Economic activity is high, and there's less anger. But at the end of the day, you have 3 political parties in Ottawa that are essentially saying that rural Albertans don't know what they're doing, don't know what they're talking about. They're a bunch of rednecks. And it's that kind of an attitude that actually creates the divisive environment in which we find ourselves operating politically.
So, from your perspective, if we go through this fair deal process and the Premier is able to come up with a better deal, do you think that there's a way that we can dampen down this feeling of alienation here in the West?
Yeah, and I agree with that. And that's why you need to have representation by region that goes hand in hand with representation by population. And I go back to electoral reform. You need to have some kind of a situation in Ottawa where 2 provinces cannot dictate to the rest of the country how to operate, and that's where the Senate reform idea comes in. Now, if we are able to get that, where our voices are heard, because I did make the point, taxation without representation, right? 34 seats in Ottawa, there are 33 seats in the Greater Toronto area, or in that general area. So you get into a situation where a large chunk of the country is actually not feeling that their voices are heard. If you give them an ability to be represented in the Senate that is equal per province, I think that does alleviate a lot of the pressure, because it makes it harder for the federal government to hammer through Bill C-69, Bill C-48. We all saw the fight they had in the Senate. And it's just, they're appointed senators where they really can't overturn legislation because they're not elected and they're not legitimate. I mean, when was the last time the Senate overturned a major piece of legislation? I mean, I can't even think of it off the top of my head. So at the end of the day, you need to have that level of representation to make it feel like people are being heard, because yeah, you may be able to implement a police force and a pension plan. You may be able to get tax points instead of health transfers, right? But at the end of the day, if you don't get changes in the way that we're represented, people are not going to feel like they're being heard, and they're going to remain frustrated, and you're going to get increased polarization over time.
Which, of course, is not really the way that anybody who celebrates Canada wants to see us go. But the point now is, this is not just some fringe perspective. It really is growing.
Yeah, it's one of those things where the only way we're really going to know if this is going to work is if we get to the table. And at this point in time, the Fair Deal Panel, it has submitted its report to the government. We have, there are steps involved with getting it from the shelves of the government offices to the public hands to the referendum stage where we do have a constitutional referendum, and then you obviously have to get to the constitutional table. Like, the only way we're ever going to know if this is going to work is if we actually follow the steps. And delaying the first step, or the second step maybe you could call it, after the panel, because the panel had to write the report, but by delaying certain steps, we're not going to get to the finish line fast enough. And as the longer this takes, the more polarized the situation gets, the angrier people get, and if you're seen as delaying it, people are going to start pointing at the provincial government, directing their anger there, because they're feeling that the provincial government isn't listening. And that's something that I think would be wise for the Premier to try and avoid.
Well, you know, you talked about the fact that some of those office suites and towers that are behind you may be completely empty, and there's this air of uncertainty. In this current environment, who's going to invest in Alberta?
Oh, and that's exactly it. You're seeing capital outflows in millions, billions of dollars even. Like, we're at the point where the lender of last resort should be the provincial government, and it has already thrown $7.5 billion in loan guarantees to build the Keystone Pipeline into the United States. It has been forced to intervene in the economy to try and ease the tension. If you look at a place like Texas, before COVID hit, the unemployment rate was around 2%, whereas in Alberta, there are places where it has barely dipped below 10% in the last 5 years. Places in rural Alberta where they are reliant on natural gas or on oil to drive their economy. And it's not just the major companies, it's the smaller companies. Like, I'm from Drumheller. You drive down the industrial section of the town, everything's either for lease, for sale. There's maybe 2 or 3 businesses per 7 or 8 buildings, right? And it's one of those things where it is incredibly depressing. And it's not just economic. Economic uncertainty also leads to mental health issues, and it just opens a Pandora's box. And if we don't get at least some movement here, we've lost so much market share as it is. How far down are we willing to be stomped before we actually stand up and start fighting for ourselves?
And that is the question. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Stuart.